At the start of the 20th century, Romania had the most anti-Semitic government on earth. There's no contest. It was worse than Russia. Proposals to emancipate Jews shortly after unification in 1859 were met with race riots, and the 1866 Constitution explicitly denied citizenship to non-Christians. In 1876, the Great Powers got involved after several countries in southeastern Europe joined Russia in a war against the Ottomans. But despite signing a peace treaty agreeing to Jewish emancipation, Romania ignored the stipulation, technically allowing Jews to become citizens, but only if they'd either fought in the war or been approved by a majority vote in parliament on an individual basis after a 10-year wait. By 1912, this courtesy had only been extended to 1,244 people and was mostly used by politicians to solicit bribes. This wasn't an artifact of a less enlightened past, at least not entirely, but was advanced by otherwise liberal nationalists as a response to the ethnic partitioning of Romania's economy that had taken place under the Ottomans, with Jewish men mostly working as merchants and industrial workers in cities, while the majority of Romanian-speaking Christians were peasants. So in their effort to industrialize, successive governments banned Jews from practicing law or medicine, peddling, selling alcohol or lottery tickets, working in the tobacco industry, finance, retail, tax collection, or railways, comprising more than one-third of workers in any factory, or attending or working in public schools. One of the few sectors of the urban economy not affected by these laws was the performing arts, leading to an explosion of Jewish theater that quickly spread beyond Romania's borders and drew Jewish workers to theater and later film around the world. At the start of the First World War, Romania had a long-standing defensive alliance with Austria-Hungary, but coveted large areas dominated by ethnic Romanians in bordering countries, including Austria-Hungary. They initially compromised by remaining neutral, arguing that Austria had instigated the war. Both sides of the conflict courted Romanian support, but ultimately the Entente allies won out by agreeing to Romania's westward territorial ambitions. The kingdom was almost immediately steamrolled by the Central Powers, knocking them out of the war. But the outbreak of the Russian Revolution did allow Bucharest to annex Bessarabia. Finally, as the Central Powers collapsed, Romania re-entered the conflict in its final days to assert its previous war aims. Despite not fighting for very long, Romania suffered one of the highest casualty rates of any country in the war, but by virtue of being on the winning side and surrounded by enemies, she got everything she wanted. The 1919 Treaty of Saint-Germain ceded Bukovina from Austria, and the 1919 Treaty of Trianon awarded Romania control over the former Hungarian territories of Transylvania, Maramuresh, Crișana, and the Banat. Due to these annexations, Romania's Jewish population tripled. What's more, these Jews had already been emancipated by their former governments, so the thought of revoking their political rights was unacceptable to the newly formed League of Nations. Prime Minister Ion Brătianu tried to assuage the League by making overtures toward Jewish emancipation, but only with strict conditions and bureaucratic hurdles designed to slow the process and discourage applications. Eventually, the League put its foot down and Bucharest relented. Brătianu resigned to preserve his pride, and Romania signed a treaty agreeing to amend its constitution and give equal citizenship to all minorities. In 1920, 3 Jews were elected to parliament, which soon passed sweeping land reforms breaking up the estates of large landowners and undermining the quasi-feudal order that had provided a rationale for the anti-Semitic laws of the past. In the election of 1922, former Austrian politician Benno Straucher was re-elected as the first deputy representing a Jewish party, while 3 others were elected from the mainstream parties. The Constitution of 1923 automatically granted citizenship to Jews within the kingdom's pre-war borders, and a 1924 statute finally created a viable path to citizenship for the entire Jewish population of Greater Romania, making it the last country in the world to emancipate its Jewish population for the first time. It was the last emancipation, and the shortest. Unfortunately for stat heads, the government didn't conduct a census until 1930. That year, Romania had a total Jewish population of 756,930, the 4th largest in the world and 4.2% of the national population. Most lived in cities, where they made up a much larger share. As the creation of Greater Romania roughly tripled the country's Jewish population, it was about evenly divided between the pre-war borders, Bessarabia, and the territories annexed from Austria and Hungary. These communities were deeply divided by language, religion, education, and wealth. More than 2/3 spoke Yiddish as their first language, but they were almost entirely concentrated in the north. In the south, most Jews spoke Romanian, and in the west, nearly half spoke Hungarian. East of the Mendelssohn line, the religious dynamic was mainly split between ultra-Orthodoxy and secularism. But west of the line, the situation was more complicated. Religiously, these communities were typically divided between modern Orthodoxy and Neolog, a uniquely Hungarian form of conservative Judaism based at the Budapest University for Jewish Studies. But it was also home to the Sziget and Satmar Hasidic dynasties, two of only 3 Hasidic movements to originate outside the Russian Empire. It was a mess of intertwined identities and prejudices. Recalling his childhood in Crișana during the transfer, Romanian communist leader Walter Roman later remarked,
"In our Oradea, the Germans said I was Hungarian, the Hungarians said I was Romanian, the Romanians said I was Jewish, but the Jews thought I was a communist, though I wasn't yet."
These divisions made for some interesting politics. As an advocacy group for Jewish emancipation, the Union of Romanian Jews had existed in some form since 1909, now working closely with Straucher's Jewish National People's Party, which had existed as a regional movement in Bukovina since 1906. Despite this, the Union generally disapproved of Jewish partisanship, preferring to support Jewish candidates in the mainstream parties. By 1926, the PPNE effectively no longer existed. With such a large population of Yiddish speakers, it should surprise no one that Romania had its own chapter of the General Jewish Labor Bund, which acted as a bloc within the larger Romanian Social Democratic Party. Other Jewish politicians joined the Social Democrats without joining the Bund, but in either case they never got very far. Romania's Social Democrats were emphatically a party of the urban proletariat in a country where most of the population still lived on farms. So instead, the Peasants' Party emerged as the preeminent leftist bloc, extending its reach into the cities and drawing support away from other socialists. Only 2 Bundists ever served in parliament. Others, like the aforementioned Walter Roman, took their chances with the local Communist Party, which formed in 1921 and attracted disproportionate support from ethnic minorities. But they eschewed electoral politics in favor of strikes and, allegedly, terrorism. The party was outlawed in 1924 and only persisted underground. None of this is to say Romania didn't have an active Zionist movement. It absolutely did, but I'll have more to say about that later. Let's be clear, the anti-Semitism of the Old Kingdom never went away. The National Liberal Party might have abandoned its old policies, but there was still a deep well of anti-Semitic thought that was already finding a new home in fascism. Professor Alexandru Constantin Cuza was made for this moment. An economist, political scientist, and deputy for the city of Iași, Cuza had flirted with socialism as a student, but soon began a lifelong migration rightward, entering parliament as a liberal in 1892 and joining the Conservatives 3 years later. Educated in France, Cuza had fallen in love with French culture, especially the Aryan supremacist theories of diplomat Arthur de Gobineau, who absolutely should have come up on this channel before, but somehow hasn't until now. In 1899, Cuza published his magnum opus About Population, which expanded on Gobineau's ideas to argue that Jews were a literal disease, genetically programmed by a false god to destroy Christianity and the Romanian race. After inciting his students to attack Iași's Jewish population, he returned to parliament on a strictly anti-Semitic platform, calling for an end to whatever legal rights Jews still had and co-founding the proto-fascist PND in 1910. But in 1919, when other PND leaders moderated and voted for Jewish emancipation, Cuza broke away, joining the People's Party, which ironically meant caucusing with Straucher, before creating Romania's first proper fascist movement, the National Christian Defense League. He called their platform the Antisemitism of Immediate Action, repealing emancipation, restoring the discriminatory laws, restricting Jews to a handful of major cities, and finally expulsion. Cuza set the template for Romanian anti-Semitism in the 20th century, particularly its fixation with demography and medicine. Cuza claimed that Jews had a much higher birth rate than Romanians at large and that racial degeneracy through intermarriage was widespread. In fact, the Jewish birth rate was lower than the country overall, which, accounting for border changes, combined with mass emigration to result in slightly negative Jewish growth And despite emancipation, most Jews in Romania remained severely segregated, making conversions and intermarriages rare even by the standards of the time. And while anti-Semitic activists elsewhere in Europe could point to Jewish luminaries in business, politics, science, and the arts as boogeymen, the laws of the 19th century had firmly relegated the Jews of the Old Kingdom to an underclass. It didn't have luminaries, and neither did Bessarabia. Nevertheless, Cuzist elites positioned themselves as freedom fighters against Jewish domination. Cuzism was most defined by the sector of society from which it drew strength: students and teachers. In 1920, a pupil of Cuza named Corneliu Zelea Codreanu successfully lobbied the Congress of Student Unions for a ban on Jewish members. 2 years later, anti-Semitic professors and students created specialized unions dedicated to this project. Their first uprising began in 1922 at the University of Cluj. Originally a Hungarian university in the heart of Transylvania dominated by minority groups, the Romanian invasion of 1919 led to a complete overhaul, installing an entirely ethnic Romanian faculty and appearing to give preferential treatment to ethnic Romanian applicants. So student unions in Bucharest and Iași were outraged when Jews continued making up a fifth of all attendees, as well as the fact that student unions there had opposed the ban on Jewish participation. Tensions were compounded by a housing shortage caused by the university's expansion, the fact that Jews made up 49% of medical students, which local newspapers falsely reported as 80%, and a shortage of cadavers for the medical school leading to fights over the treatment of Jewish bodies. In November, the Petru-Maior Student Center began rioting in support of limits on the number of Jewish admissions and a requirement that Jewish medical students only be allowed to study Jewish cadavers. The chaos spread to the wider city, and by December, student unions had orchestrated uprisings at every university in the country. Refusing to discriminate between equal citizens, the government cracked down, but this only hardened the students' resolve, disrupting the entire next semester. Only an intervention by the army in May 1923 allowed studies to resume as normal. But this wasn't the end. In the course of that school year, student activists had effectively merged their operations with the National Christian Defense League, uniting students, local police, and some members of the national secret police known as the Siguranța to lead a wave of pogroms across Transylvania. In Satu Mare, a Jewish student named Heinrich Kluger was hanged from a lamppost after being forced to watch his mother doused in gasoline and burned alive. In Teiuș, students captured Jewish women and forced them to run naked into the town square in December. One participant in the Cluj riots, Ion Moța, was arrested for plotting to assassinate multiple politicians, but, despite pleading guilty, was still acquitted by an all-lunk jury. On trial for a similar plot, Zelea Codreanu murdered Iași police prefect Constantin Manciu. Despite shooting Manciu from behind and wounding several others in plain view at the courthouse where he was being tried, Zelea Codreanu claimed self-defense on the grounds that Manciu had dared to arrest him for his heroic struggle against the Jews. Bucharest responded with new anti-terrorism laws, but prosecutors were unable to find an impartial jury. He was acquitted in just 5 minutes. After publicly endorsing the murder, Professor Cuza was forced to resign from the University of Iași, but the acquittals demonstrated that the law was no obstacle to the anti-Semitic project. One night in October 1925, a detachment of border guards led by one Lieutenant Morarescu intercepted about 200 refugees fleeing the Soviet Union, most of them Jewish. Morarescu encouraged the refugees to cross into Romania in exchange for a 1,000-ruble bribe before ordering his men to rob everyone. He then allowed the non-Jews to continue on their way, but held the Jews captive, forced them to dance until dawn, and finally had them all shot. At his court-martial, Morarescu defended his actions on the ground that he was following orders to shoot anyone he saw crossing the border on sight, despite not shooting everyone, nor shooting anyone on sight. He even detailed shooting a refugee mother in the head with her baby still in her arms, but as usual was acquitted, after which he joined Zelea Codreanu on a lecture tour of Bukovina, declaring, "I have killed 135 Jews and I will kill a lot more." In 1926, Jewish high schoolers in Czernowitz began protesting against discrimination at the hands of those administering university entrance exams, with 5 suing on the grounds that their test results had been ignored for the purpose of limiting Jewish admissions. During the trial, a 21-year-old Lank member named Nikolai Totu arrived from Iași and murdered the leader of the group, David Falik. Not only was Totu acquitted despite bragging about his guilt, but several of Falik's classmates were disciplined by their school for attending Falik's funeral. The other students were indicted for protesting, though the charges were soon dropped, and the killing inspired a year-long wave of pogroms targeting Jewish students, train passengers, and synagogues. Where did this impulse come from? In countries like Italy, Germany, Hungary, even the United Kingdom, the rise of fascism was largely driven by dissatisfaction with the outcome of the First World War. But no country had less reason to complain than Romania. As I said, it got everything it asked for, which couldn't be said for any other country. Yet the volume of ultra-nationalist violence in Romania, and perhaps more importantly the degree of public sympathy for it, was unmatched by any other country. Historian Jean Ancel argued that the nationalist movement was a victim of victory. Its intellectuals had achieved their main objectives so quickly that it left them without a sense of purpose, leaving them to cling to the anti-Semitic element like a life raft, reframing the subjugation and removal of Romanian Jewry as the final struggle. The Falik incident was a breaking point in many ways. It solidified a rift between Cuza and Zelea Codreanu that had steadily grown over the previous 4 years. Though Cuza had paid a heavy price defending the violence, he maintained that the anti-Semitic project could and should be achieved peacefully, as with any other public health initiative. But the much younger Zelea Codreanu wasn't only a pupil of Cuza. In addition to following the developments of foreign fascists like Mussolini and Hitler, he may have suffered from psychotic delusions, claiming he'd been sent by God to be martyred in the Romanian race's final battle against the Jews, who were satanic and more powerful than God himself. Don't ask me how that works. I already looked the other way when Cuza claimed that Jews were creations of a false god. Zelea Codreanu called this ideology Christian legionary mysticism, but I've also seen it called Christo-fascist necropolitics. Suffice it to say, we're in exotic territory. In 1927, he broke from Lank to form the Legion of the Archangel Michael, colloquially known as the Green Shirts, and later renamed the Iron Guard. At first glance, their impact on national politics was minimal. Lank won 10 seats in the Chamber of Deputies during its first election in 1926, but lost them all in 1927 and failed to win any in 1928. The Iron Guard never even got close. Throughout the 1920s, the three main parties were united in opposition to fascism and anti-Semitism, but that doesn't mean they didn't harbor fascist or anti-Semitic factions. By the Falik incident, any will to discipline those factions had faded, and over the latter half of the decade, they began indulging the nationalist fervor that Lank and the Iron Guard had manufactured. The term Overton window didn't exist yet, but this process would eventually enter the Hebrew language as hitkarnefut, or rhinocerization. As it turned out, fascists didn't need to win power in order to exercise it. But rhinocerization also gave the mainstream parties ammunition to accuse each other of being soft on fascism. As Czernowitz's deputy for the opposition PNL, Meyer Ebner lambasted the ruling People's Party for failing to treat the Falik incident as part of a wider anti-Semitic mania. Whether or not that accusation was fair, I don't know, it paid off. In 1928, voters promoted Ebner to the Senate while electing 3 new Jewish deputies from the National Peasants' Party. Until now, the fascists' failure to break into parliament meant that, instead of circling the wagons, Jewish lawmakers had a lot more freedom to distinguish themselves ideologically. But rhinocerization made a united front much more attractive, intensifying an ongoing rift between the Jews in parliament and the UER, which means we can finally talk about Zionism. Though the UER wasn't uniformly opposed to Zionism, its leader was a Zionist, the Jewish MPs found the group's aversion to sectarianism impractical in the face of constant violence. By contrast, the Magyar Party had found great success representing Hungarian speakers in Transylvania, including Jews, and formed successful alliances with past governments. Reasoning that a united Jewish bloc could do the same, Ebner formed the Jewish Party, which won 4 seats in the 1931 election, with a 5th joining soon after. Romania in the late 19th century had been a hotbed of early Zionism, producing figures like Rabbi Moses Gaster and Aharon Aharonson. The Jewish MPs of this time were very much part of that early tradition, and initially the party tried to represent what they saw as the interests of all Romanian Jews, including leftists and non-Zionists. But by this time, the Great Depression was emboldening fascism across Europe, and Romania was no exception. The same 1931 election that saw victories for the Jewish Party also returned Lank to parliament, with the Iron Guard winning its first seats the following year. This triggered a new wave of violence, beginning when border guards nearly incited a riot in the majority Jewish town of Soroga after murdering 6 Soviet Jewish refugees that they lured across the river Dniester seemingly just for fun. Lank and Iron Guard deputies argued in the chamber that Jews weren't biologically human, shouting down and at times beating Jewish party deputies to prevent them from speaking. The party was also under attack from the UER and many prominent rabbis due to its separatist connotations. In Transylvania especially, rival Jewish movements were quick to call the authorities or even incite violence to disrupt Jewish party campaign events, making it hard to run candidates at all. But the final straw was a new party manifesto in 1933. Ebner and company may have identified with the old general Zionists, but a lot had changed by this time. The liberal, nonpartisan cultural movement espoused by Zionism's first generation was dying out, displaced by David Ben-Gurion's left-wing Mapai. The movement in diaspora had undergone a similar evolution, but while socialist groups like Hechalutz and Hashomer HaTzair were active in Romania, they tended not to concern themselves with Romania's domestic politics. Discontent with all of these factions had recently given rise to the right-wing Hatzoar, represented in Romania by journalist, novelist, and religious mystic Avram Leib Zissou. Zissou never held elected office, but he had been appointed as the party's honorary president, and by 1933 he had enough clout to formulate a new platform that was more right-wing and, perhaps more importantly, called for Jews to be reclassified as a national minority like the Germans and Hungarians. On top of practical obstacles like the lack of a common language, the UER viewed reclassification as a step backwards, evidence of a certain yearning for the ghetto, which only reconfirmed their suspicions about the party. The Jewish Party never enjoyed support from a majority of Jewish voters, but Zissou's overhaul absolutely doomed it. In the 1933 election, their vote share collapsed and they lost all their seats, as did all other Jewish candidates. The same happened to the Iron Guard, and Lank lost some seats as well, but this only sent the fight against fascism back onto the streets.
I was born in Romania, and I am Jewish. That makes me a Jew and a Romanian. For me to go around and join conferences demanding that my identity as a Jewish Romanian be taken seriously would be as crazy as the lime trees on the island where I was born to form a conference demanding the right to be lime trees. As for anyone who tells me that I am not Romanian, the answer is the same. Go talk to the trees and tell them they are not trees.
In 1934, Josef Mendel Hechter wrote For 2,000 Years, a historical novel striking back against the anti-Semitic intellectualism which, by this time, had utterly consumed Romania. His manuscript completed, Hechter sought to publicize the book with a flashy foreword by his longtime benefactor Nae Ionescu, philosopher and editor of the newspaper Cuvântul. Ionescu violated their friendship by composing a viciously anti-Semitic foreword that contradicted the book's own message. At the time, he was already in the process of transforming Cuvântul into a mouthpiece for the Iron Guard. Many of Hechter's friends and colleagues joined the Guard, publishing anti-Semitic rants in newspapers or even shouting them directly to his face. Not all of his friends by any means, but Hechter, changing his name to Iosif Mihail Sebastian, made no distinction. He couldn't imagine a permanent turn toward fascism and anti-Semitism. To the very end, he considered them good friends, temporarily misled. By this time, Cuza's framing of Jews as a disease was starting to appear in medical journals. In The Biological Fundamentals of Race, one Dr. Grigorescu blamed Jews for causing alcoholism, tuberculosis, and syphilis due to a biological imperative to weaken and destroy the superior Romanian race. This line of thought would only intensify in the years to come. Meanwhile, Romania's failure to recover from the Great Depression and the criminalization of labor action emboldened the underground communists, whose treatment by the justice system offered a stark contrast to the extreme leniency afforded to fascists. In July 1935, the Siguranța raided the apartment of Communist International operative Anna Pauker, arresting 18 leading communists as well as Pauker's landlord and charging them with sedition. Of the 19 defendants, 7 were Jewish and 8 hailed from some other minority group, so you can imagine how Lank and the Iron Guard reacted. Rather than contest their case in Bucharest, inviting clashes between fascist and communist militias, the trial was moved to the much more conservative city of Craiova, where all of the defendants were found guilty. Pauker was sentenced to 20 years in prison, which probably saved her life. Back in the Soviet Union, her husband Marcel was executed as part of Stalin's Great Purge, and she likely would have joined him. She returned to the USSR as part of a prisoner exchange in early 1941, which also probably saved her life. This isn't an endorsement of Pauker. She would go on to commit atrocities of her own. But it's telling that, even as the main political parties opposed both communism and fascism, the justice system became more effective at rooting out communists than fascists. Relocating the trial failed to deter the feared clashes. The mainstream was losing control. Fresh elections in 1937 resulted in a hung parliament. For the first time, no party had an absolute majority in the Chamber of Deputies. To make things worse, support for the far right had surged. Under the name Everything for the Country, the Iron Guard was now the third largest party in the chamber, with Cuza's renamed National Christian Party as a close fourth. In theory, this was a surmountable problem. The National Liberals and National Peasants just had to form a coalition, but they just couldn't make it happen in time. Unfortunately, much as in Germany, the 1923 Constitution granted the head of state unilateral power to appoint a government irrespective of the will of Parliament. So King Carol II awarded the mandate to the fourth-place National Christians, appointing Octavian Goga as Prime Minister and Cuza as Minister of State. You'd think that a government with only 39 deputies and 0 senators wouldn't be able to do much, but with support from the Iron Guard and the lurking anti-Semitic elements of the PNL and PNT, they got straight to work. Just 3 weeks in, Goga passed Decree No. 169 on the revision of citizenship. Henceforth, all Jews, and only Jews, who'd become citizens under the Naturalization Law of 1924 were given 20 days to present evidence to the court proving that both they and their parents had been born in what was now Romania and that they had no dual citizenship in order to remain legally Romanian. This was also the Goga government's only major legislation. Though the king supported the PNC's efforts against the Jews, he was disturbed by their collaboration with the Iron Guard, one of several parties calling to curtail the powers of the monarchy. So starting in February 1938, Karl invoked emergency powers, deposed the Goga government, and established a single-party dictatorship known as the National Renaissance Front. The Iron Guard was banned. Zelea Codreanu was convicted of treason, and in November, he and his inner circle were covertly executed, dissolved in acid, and mixed into concrete. He finally got his wish. Jewish leaders weren't happy about the death of democracy, but the overthrow of Goga and Cuza was certainly a relief. Briefly, in March, the king issued a new decree which not only affirmed the prior law, but required Jews to provide their original birth certificates and notarized proof of legal residence in the country in 1918. A lot of people didn't have those, particularly the very poor, those born in Bessarabia when it had been part of the Russian Empire, and those whose homes and belongings were destroyed in the war. Even if you did have those documents, you'd better hope that there weren't any variations in spelling, which was all but inevitable for those living in annexed territories where the official language had been Russian, German, or Hungarian. Altogether, the process stripped citizenship from over a third of Romania's Jews, enabling the king to institute a regressive head tax on all non-citizen workers and employers. This was one of several decrees issued by the king on the same day, most of them creating new institutions to establish his own cult of personality. And this was only the warm-up. Goga had begun to bring Romania closer to Nazi Germany, but King Carl sought to imitate it, and did so almost entirely without German influence. And it wasn't going to stop. Within 2 years, the king would be dead, but his project would live on, along with a resurgent Iron Guard and a replication of the Nuremberg laws. It wasn't a temporary phase, it was just beginning. Special thanks to my patrons, including Mir Akbar Ali, Jeremy Biskin, Boris Cherny, Dr. Chike, Mihol Dahi, Andrew Ettinger, FC, Jay Fleischman, Osher Gordon, Bob Huddy, Raphael Kellerman, Adam Kershaw, Sol Cohn, Milk and Honey, and Jeffrey Schweitzer.